They rescued a dog. Then she gave birth to so many puppies, it left everyone in tears. Sarah Miller hunched over her kitchen table, the dim glow of her cracked laptop casting a faint blue sheen across her weary face as rain pounded the tin roof of her small bungalow in Willow Creek, Tennessee. It was late November 2024, the clock blinking 9:17 p.m., and the air inside her home carried the damp musk of wet fur mixed with the fading scent of chamomile tea cooling in a chipped mug. Her three foster dogs, Sprout, a wiry terrier mixed with a bark too big for his frame, Amos, a blind old hound whose snores rumbled like distant thunder, and Luna, a one-eared pit bull chewing relentlessly on a squeaky toy, lounged across the living room, unfazed by the storm shaking the windows. Sarah, 34 and lean from years of wrangling strays, rubbed her temples, her hazel eyes scanning a backlog of adoption applications she'd meant to tackle days ago. She'd ditched a soul-sucking office job 3 years back to rescue dogs full-time. But tonight, with food supplies dwindling and vet bills stacking up, the choice felt like a weight she couldn't shake. Her phone buzzed sharply, cutting through the hum of the rain. The screen lit up with a name that spelled urgency. Jenny Carter, the shelter volunteer whose calls always carried bad news. Sarah's thumb hovered over the decline button. Her fridge held half a bag of kibble, her bank account was a joke, and she hadn't slept properly in weeks. But Jenny wasn't the type to ring for nothing. With a resigned groan, she picked up. "Sarah, I've got a crisis," Jenny's voice crackled, breathless against the storm's roar. "German Shepherd, female, pregnant, due any second. She's on the kill list at the county shelter. Tonight's her last shot, and I've got no fosters left. I'm bringing her to you." Sarah's stomach lurched, a cold dread settling in. "Jenny, I'm tapped out. 3 dogs already, no space, no cash." "She's in labor, Sarah. Active labor. Contractions started an hour ago. If we don't take her, she's dead by morning, pups and all. Please, I'm begging you." The words landed like a slap. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, her mind conjuring the image. A swollen shepherd pacing a concrete kennel under harsh, fluorescent lights, her belly taut with life, the shelter's clock ticking down to a lethal injection. She'd witnessed the kill list's toll before. Overcrowding forced hard calls and pregnant dogs were burdens few wanted. Her head screamed no, she was stretched to breaking, but her heart, stubborn and soft, refused to let go. "Fine," she said, voice tight. "Bring her. But you're buying me coffee for a month." "Bless you," Jenny breathed, and the line clicked off. Sarah shoved the laptop aside and stood, splashing cold water on her face at the sink to jolt herself awake. She tugged on her faded green raincoat, patched with duct tape, and stepped onto the porch, the wind lashing her dark hair into knots as rain stung her cheeks. 20 minutes later, headlights pierced the downpour, Jenny's beat-up hatchback skidding to a halt in the muddy driveway. The passenger door flew open, and Jenny stumbled out, wrestling a leash attached to a massive German Shepherd. The dog's black and tan coat was plastered to her frame, soaked through, her belly swaying low like a ticking bomb. She yanked against the leash, paws slipping in the muck, then collapsed with a pitiful whine, her amber eyes darting wildly. "Meet Denali," Jenny shouted over the gale, shoving a soggy bag of kibble into Sarah's arms. "She's a mess, terrified out of her mind. Street dog or breeder reject, who knows? She's yours now. I've got to get back." "Wait, what?" Sarah sputtered, but Jenny was already diving into the car, tires spinning as she peeled away into the night. Rain soaked Sarah's jeans as she dropped to her knees beside Denali, the shepherd's ribs heaving with each shallow breath. She was enormous, her pregnancy stretching her thin frame to the brink, and those amber eyes held a raw, desperate plea that pierced Sarah's chest. "Hey, baby girl," she murmured, her hand brushing wet fur with deliberate calm. Denali flinched, a low growl rumbling, but Sarah didn't pull back. "You're safe now. I've got you." Footsteps splashed behind her. Jake, her 16-year-old son, loomed in the doorway, his lanky frame hunched under a drenched hoodie. "Mom, what the hell's going on?" he asked, voice thick with sleep and confusion. "New foster," Sarah said, not breaking eye contact with Denali. "She's having puppies, right now. Help me get her inside. Jake blinked, then nodded, crouching beside her. They coaxed Denali to her feet, Sarah supporting her shoulders, Jake at her haunches, her claws scraping the ground as they half-carried her across the threshold. Inside, the other dogs erupted, Sprout yapping, Amos howling, Luna bounding over with her toy. But Denali ignored them, collapsing onto the living room rug in a tight curl, her breathing ragged with contractions. Sarah sank onto the couch, wiping rain and mud from her face. Jake hovered nearby, hands stuffed in his pockets. She gonna make it? He asked quietly. She has to, Sarah said, more to herself than him. She met Denali's flickering gaze across the dim room, a fleeting connection, fragile but real. Outside, the storm raged, shaking the windows. Inside, a different tempest brewed, one of survival, trust, and a bond yet to take shape. This wasn't just another rescue, it was a lifeline, and Sarah was all in, ready or not. Sarah jolted awake on the couch, her neck stiff and her mind foggy, when a faint whine from Denali cut through the early morning stillness. She rubbed her eyes and glanced across the living room, where the German shepherd lay curled in her corner, a sodden heap of black and tan fur still damp from last night's rain. The storm had eased to a soft drizzle, gray light filtering through the windows, but Denali hadn't budged, an island of fear amid the chaos of Sprout's restless pacing, Amos's deep snores, and Luna's toy squeaking. Her amber eyes tracked every movement, Jake's footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, her ears twitching like radar, her swollen belly a silent testament to the lives waiting within. Jake shuffled downstairs, his sneakers scuffing the hardwood, swapped his hoodie for a faded Metallica tee. She eat yet? He asked, nodding at the untouched kibble bowl Sarah had set out hours ago. Nope, Sarah replied, stretching as she stood, her knees popping from last night's ordeal. Won't touch the water either. She's been through hell. Street dog or locked in some kennel her whole life, I'd guess. Those eyes don't trust easy. She's huge, Jake said, crouching a safe distance away. Puppies coming soon, huh? Denali's ears flicked at his voice, but her gaze stayed locked on the floor, unyielding. Sarah grabbed a blanket from the couch and settled beside her, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her trembling frame, but not so close as to spook her. We've got to get through to her, she said softly. She's too scared to even live yet. The next few days turned into a quiet battle of patience. Sarah took the morning shifts, sitting cross-legged on the rug, her voice a steady hum against the house's usual clamor. She sang old folk tunes. Black is the color of my true love's hair. Wayfaring stranger. Her alto cracking from exhaustion, but carrying a warmth she hoped Denali could sense. She talked, too, about nothing and everything. The crisp Tennessee air outside. The way the leaves turned gold before falling. The first dog she'd rescued. A scruffy mutt named Rusty who'd slept on her feet every night. You'd have liked him, she murmured once, her fingers hovering near Denali's matted ear. He was a fighter, like you. Jake handled the afternoons, sprawling on the floor with his phone in one hand and a fistful of kibble in the other. He'd ramble about school, his latest Minecraft build, or the time he'd wiped out on his skateboard and nearly broke his nose. You'd be a pro at dodging stuff, huh? He'd say, tossing a piece of kibble toward Denali's paws. It rolled untouched, joining a growing pile of rejects. The leash stayed on its hook by the door. Sarah had tried it once, on day 2, and Denali's low growl had stopped her cold. Freedom would come later. By day 4, worry gnawed at Sarah's edges. Denali's belly seemed to swell by the hour, her ribs barely visible beneath the strain, but she'd only nibbled at the food Sarah coaxed her with. She's got to eat, Sarah muttered, rubbing her temples as she stared at the untouched bowl. Those pups need her strong. She rummaged through a closet and pulled out a faded stuffed squirrel, its tail half chewed from Luna's puppy days, and set it near Denali's nose, hoping for a spark. Nothing. Just those amber eyes watching her like a hawk, untrusting and unyielding. The shift came on the 6th day, a snowy Sunday afternoon. Jake had cracked a window, letting a chill sweep through, and Sarah sat with Denali again, her throat too raw from singing to muster another tune. She talked instead about Rusty, how he'd taught her to see the good in broken things. You're not broken, she whispered, voice barely audible. Just bent a little. We'll fix that together, okay? Denali's head lifted, a slow tilt, her nose twitching towards Sarah's outstretched hand. Then, miracle of miracles, her tail flicked. Once, twice, a hesitant wag that stopped Sarah's breath. "Jake!" she hissed, waving him over from the couch. He dropped his phone and scrambled to her side, eyes wide as Denali's tail moved again, a faint rhythm against the rug. "No way," he breathed, grinning. "She's waking up." Sarah's laugh bubbled up, shaky and bright, and she reached out, brushing Denali's ear with the lightest touch. This time the shepherd didn't flinch, just leaned into it, her gaze softening, the wild edge dulling into something fragile. Trust, maybe, or the promise of it. Sarah's throat tightened. "There you are, baby," she said. "Welcome home." But that night, the fragile peace shattered. At 3 a.m., a frantic scratching from upstairs yanked Sarah awake. She grabbed a flashlight and crept up the steps, Jake trailing behind, bleary but alert. The beam caught Denali mid-motion, paws clawing at the carpet in the guest room, body hunched, a low whine spilling from her throat. Her amber eyes locked on Sarah's, wild with panic and purpose. Labor had begun. Sarah bolted upright from the couch, her hand fumbling for the flashlight as a sharp, frantic scratching echoed from upstairs, slicing through the stillness of the night. It was 3 a.m., snow falling thick outside and cloaking Willow Creek in silence. But her pulse raced as she climbed the creaky steps, Jake stumbling behind her, his breath short and nervous. The beam of light caught Denali in the guest room, paws digging at the carpet, body hunched on the blanket nest Sarah had set up that afternoon, a low whine spilling from her throat. Her amber eyes met Sarah's, wide with panic yet driven by instinct, signaling the moment they'd been bracing for since that rainy rescue. "You're doing great, girl," Sarah whispered, dropping to her knees beside Denali, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her. Jake hovered in the doorway, his teenage bravado gone, replaced by wide eyes and a clenched jaw. "Mom, is she okay?" he asked, barely audible over Denali's labored breathing. "She will be," Sarah said, though a flicker of doubt gnawed at her. Denali's ribs heaved with each contraction, her frame trembling, exhausted, fragile, but resolute. She'd been through too much already, her matted coat and thin body a testament to a life of neglect. And now she carried 11 pups, maybe more. Sarah brushed a hand along her flank, feeling the muscles tense and ripple. "Come on, baby, you've got this." Time stretched into a tense, sleepless blur. Sarah stayed close, murmuring encouragement, while Jake darted to the bathroom for towels and a bowl of warm water, his sneakers squeaking on the hardwood. At 4:15, a faint whimper broke the rhythm of Denali's whines, and her body arched. A tiny, slick bundle slid onto the blanket, a puppy, dark and wet, no bigger than Sarah's hand. Denali turned, nosing it instinctively, her tongue rasping over the fragile form until a weak squeak pierced the air. "She did it!" Jake exclaimed, a grin splitting his face as he crouched beside Sarah. She nodded, relief flooding her, and used a towel to gently rub the pup dry. Its eyes were sealed shut, its body warm and alive, a miracle in miniature. "One down," she said, setting the little one near Denali's side. The shepherd's gaze flicked to her, then back to the pup, a new light in her eyes, pride perhaps, or recognition of what she'd just done. But there was no pause. 15 minutes later, another contraction hit, and a second pup emerged, then a third, each birth a small triumph marked by Denali's quiet strength. Sarah marveled at her, the way she licked each one clean, nudging them toward her warmth, even as her own energy faded. By 6 a.m., 7 pups squirmed against her, their tiny cries filling the room. Jake sat cross-legged, counting them off like a scoreboard. "7's lucky, right?" he said, his voice hoarse from the long night. Sarah managed a tired smile, but her eyes stayed on Denali. The shepherd's breathing grew shallower, her movements slower, and a knot tightened in Sarah's stomach. "She's not done," she said, brushing sweat from her brow. The room felt stifling despite the cold seeping through the window, the air thick with the musky scent of birth. 8, 9, 10. Puppies kept coming, each one a testament to Denali's resilience, but also a drain on her fragile frame. The crisis hit with the 11th. Dawn was breaking, a pale gray light filtering through the blinds, when Denali let out a sharp yelp, her body shuddering violently. Sarah leaned in, heart in her throat, as another pup emerged, smaller, too still. No, 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 she muttered, scooping it up in a towel. It wasn't moving, its chest silent under her fingers. Panic clawed at her. After all this, to lose one now was unbearable. She rubbed its tiny body, willing it to breathe, her hands shaking. Come on, little guy, come on. Denali lifted her head, ears pricked, and let out a low, desperate whine. Then, as if summoned by her mother's call, the pup twitched. A faint gasp escaped its lungs, and Sarah nearly sobbed as she handed it back. Denali nosed it gently, licking until it squeaked, joining its siblings in the wriggling pile. You're a trooper, Sarah whispered, tears stinging her eyes. She rested a hand on Denali's head, and for the first time the dog didn't flinch, just leaned into the touch, exhausted but triumphant. 11. That was the final count. Sarah sat back, legs numb, watching Denali curl around her brood. The pups, some black and tan like their mother, others a softer gray, nuzzled against her, their cries softening into contented squeaks. Jake let out a shaky laugh, running a hand through his messy hair. 11 puppies, Mom. That's insane. Insane and beautiful, Sarah said, her voice thick. She met Denali's gaze, not fear this time, but gratitude, a bond forged in this raw, miraculous night. Denali lifted her head from her blanket nest as the high-pitched yips of 11 puppies echoed through Sarah's living room, their playful chaos filling the space with a warmth that rivaled the fireplace's steady crackle. 3 weeks had passed since that snowy night of birth, and December had wrapped Willow Creek in a deep, glistening winter. The pups, now plump and wobbly, ruled the house, tumbling over each other in a makeshift pen of crates and blankets, their antics a daily delight. Sarah had named them with Jake's help. Bandit for the bold one with a mask-like face, Pebble for the tiny gray runt, Thunder for the loudest howler. Denali watched over them, her amber eyes calm, her once tense frame softened by motherhood and the trust she'd slowly built with Sarah. Christmas loomed just a week away, and adoption day crept closer. Sarah had posted photos online, puppies wrestling, Denali gazing regally from her nest, and the responses poured in. Families from across Tennessee clamored for them, their emails brimming with promises of fenced yards and cozy beds. Sarah vetted each one late into the night, her pen scratching notes by lamplight, determined to find perfection for every pup. But beneath the joy simmered a quiet ache. Denali had become her shadow, following her from room to room, resting her head on Sarah's knee during quiet moments. Letting her go felt like losing a piece of herself. The big day arrived on December 23rd, a crisp morning with sunlight glinting off fresh snow. Sarah strung fairy lights on the porch and set out cookies for the adopters, a small buffer against the goodbye. The puppies wrestled in their pen as cars pulled into the driveway. Kids in puffy coats, parents with eager smiles, each clutching leashes and toys. Sarah stood by the door, clipboard in hand, her throat tight as she matched names to faces. Jake hovered, his usual smirk gone, replaced by a furrowed brow. One by one, the puppies left. Bandit went to a young couple with a toddler who squealed at his antics. Pebble snuggled into the arms of an older woman who'd lost her last dog to age. Thunder bounded off with two brothers promising endless fetch. Each goodbye stabbed. Sarah handed over leashes, forced smiles, watched taillights fade. Jake stayed quiet, petting each pup a final time, his hands lingering. By noon, the pen was empty, the house eerily still. Only Denali remained, her pups gone in a single morning, and Sarah felt the weight settle like snow on her shoulders. She sank onto the couch, Denali curling beside her, head heavy on her lap. You did good, Mama, Sarah murmured, stroking her ears. Denali's tail thumped once, but her eyes searched Sarah's face, sensing the shift. The final adoption loomed, Denali's own, and Sarah wasn't ready. She'd grown used to her quiet strength, the way she'd nudge her hand or lie at her feet while she worked. The last car arrived at dusk, a pickup crunching through the snow. The Hendersons stepped out, a retired couple with gentle smiles and a farm an hour north near a lake. They'd lost their shepherd years back and wanted Denali to fill the silence. Sarah led them in, recounting her story, the rescue, the birth, her fight for her pups. Mrs. Henderson knelt, offering a hand, and Denali leaned in, tail wagging slow and sure. "She's a sweetheart," Mr. Henderson said, voice gruff. "Big yard, warm barn. She'll be queen there." Sarah nodded, chest aching. "She deserves it," she said, gathering Denali's blanket and the stuffed squirrel she'd claimed. She walked them to the truck, then knelt in the snow, cupping Denali's face. "Live your best life, baby," she whispered, tears falling. Denali pressed her nose to Sarah's cheek, then turned to the Hendersons, stepping toward her new beginning. In March 2025, a letter arrived. Denali on a farm porch, radiant with a note. "She's our heart. Thank you." Sarah smiled, tracing the photo. The bond lingered, a quiet legacy of trust and love.